England, 1862, Victorian era. The gold-plated mirrors of the Duchess of Rutland's Hall reflected 1,000 points of candlelight across the gathered elite of London society. Near a marble pillar, partially obscured by the arrangement of hothouse roses, stood Miss Margaret Hensley, her 40 years evident in the dignified set of her shoulders as she observed the glittering spectacle before her. "Have you seen?" A young countess's voice carried clearly despite the attempted whisper to her companion. "Miss Hensley has appeared yet again this season. 40 years old, no fortune to speak of, and still attending as though hope remained. She simply needs to accept her fate. No duke will ever look past that shelf." The words, though meant to wound, met Margaret's ears with the dull familiarity of a well-worn blade. She did not flinch, did not turn. Instead, she smoothed the deep burgundy velvet of her gown, a rich, mature color chosen deliberately to signal her refusal to fade into invisibility, and lifted her chin with practiced grace. At 40, Margaret Hensley had become intimately acquainted with such cruelty. The eldest daughter of the respectable but unremarkable Hensley family, she had endured 2 full decades of social seasons, watching as younger women, including her own sister, secured marriages, established households, and moved forward into lives of purpose, while society regarded her with that particular mixture of pity and contempt reserved for spinsters who refused to vanish. Margaret came a concerned voice at her side. Her younger sister, Eleanor, now the married and respectable Mrs. Ashford, touched her arm gently. "You appear weary. Shall I have Thomas fetch the carriage?" "I am quite well, Eleanor," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. "I was merely observing the new season's offerings. The Duchess has assembled quite the collection of eligible young ladies this year." Eleanor's expression softened with worry. "Margaret, you need not subject yourself to these gatherings any longer. No one would fault you if I were to retreat entirely from society," Margaret finished for her, a rare flash of steel entering her usually measured tone. "If I were to become the reclusive maiden aunt, appearing only for christenings and funerals, conveniently forgotten between family obligations." She turned to face her sister fully, her intelligent hazel eyes, her one claim to remarkable beauty, burning with quiet defiance. "No, Eleanor, I may not have secured a husband. I may have failed by every measure society deems important, but I refuse to disappear as though I never existed at all." Before Eleanor could respond, a profound silence descended upon the ballroom. Even the orchestra's melody seemed to falter and fade. Conversations died mid-sentence, fans stilled in mid-flutter. "His Grace," the Duke of Ravenwood, the butler's voice rang out from the grand entrance, each syllable weighted with significance. Every head turned, every eye fixed on the doorway. Edmund Charles, the 6th Duke of Ravenwood, stood framed in the entrance like a figure from legend, tall and commanding in impeccable evening attire. His dark hair swept back from a face of austere, classical beauty. At 38, he remained the most famous bachelor in England, perhaps in all of Europe. His title stretched back centuries, his fortune was incomprehensible, and his estates encompassed more land than some small kingdoms. "He looks even more severe than usual," Eleanor whispered, unconsciously moving closer to Margaret, as though for protection from the Duke's formidable presence. "I wonder which poor debutante's mother will thrust her daughter into his path tonight." Margaret watched, as she had watched countless times before, as the assembled company parted before the Duke like waves before the prow of a great ship. Despite his legendary wealth and unassailable position, Edmund Charles was known throughout society for his profound aloofness, his impossibly exacting standards, and his apparent immunity to even the most beautiful and accomplished young women of the ton. He had refused 3 near-perfect matches this season alone, each rejection delivered with such cold finality that 2 of the rejected young ladies had retreated to the countryside in tears, while the 3rd had accepted a lesser match within the week simply to salvage her pride. The Duke's grey eyes, described by one poet as winter itself made manifest, swept across the ballroom with the detached assessment of a man surveying property he had no intention of purchasing. And then, impossibly, those cold grey eyes stopped. They stopped on Margaret. The cold grey eyes of Edmund Charles swept across the ballroom with the mechanical precision of a man performing an unwelcome duty. Margaret watched from her position by the pillar, as she had watched 100 times before, as the Duke's gaze passed over the season's most celebrated beauties without so much as a flicker of interest. Lady Pemberton's daughter, renowned for her golden ringlets and porcelain complexion, might have been invisible for all the attention he paid her. Miss Charlotte Worthing, who had caused 3 near duels among younger sons this season alone, received not even a polite nod. The Honourable Miss Arabella Grey, whose dowry could purchase a small county, was dismissed with the same cold indifference as a servant. "He'll refuse them all again," Eleanor whispered, her grip tightening on Margaret's arm, "just as he has refused everyone for—" Eleanor's words died in her throat. The Duke's eyes had stopped moving. They had stopped on Margaret. For a moment so brief she thought she might have imagined it, those winter-grey eyes locked with hers across the vast expanse of the ballroom. Margaret felt her breath catch, her heart stumbling over itself in her chest. Then, with the inevitability of a storm approaching across an open plain, Edmund Charles began to move. Not toward the debutantes who preened and postured in his path, not toward the eager mothers who positioned their daughters like chess pieces on a board. Toward her. The crowd parted before him, but now their movements were uncertain, confused. Whispers erupted like wildfire. Fans fluttered with unprecedented speed as matrons leaned toward one another, their faces masks of shock and speculation. "He cannot be—" someone gasped nearby. "Surely he mistakes her for—" another voice hissed. But the Duke's trajectory was unmistakable, his purpose clear in every measured step. Margaret felt Eleanor's fingers dig into her arm with painful intensity, felt her own body tense as though preparing for a blow. He stopped before her, so close she could see the fine weave of his evening coat, could detect the subtle scent of sandalwood and something darker, more complex. Up close, his face was even more arresting than at a distance, all sharp angles and aristocratic planes, a face carved for command rather than comfort. For a long, suspended moment he simply looked at her, not at her gown, not past her to some more suitable recipient of his attention, at her. His eyes traced the contours of her face with an intensity that made her skin flush despite the coolness of his expression. Then, with a grace that belied his imposing stature, Edmund Charles, Duke of Ravenwood, bowed. "Miss Hensley," he said, his voice a low, cultured baritone that seemed to resonate in her very bones, "I believe the next waltz is approaching. Would you do me the honor?" The ballroom, which had been a symphony of whispers, fell into absolute silence. Even the orchestra, preparing for the next set, seemed to falter in confusion. Margaret's mind reeled. This could not be happening. The most famous bachelor in England did not ask 40-year-old spinsters to dance, did not single them out from across crowded ballrooms, did not look at them as though they were the only person in a room of hundreds. "Your Grace, Her voice emerged barely above a whisper, strangled by disbelief and something dangerously close to hope. "I fear there has been some mistake." "I make very few mistakes, Miss Hensley," he replied, and for the first time the harsh line of his mouth softened almost imperceptibly. "And I am not in the habit of asking twice. The waltz?" He extended his gloved hand toward her, palm up, waiting. Margaret felt Eleanor release her arm, heard her sister's sharp intake of breath. Around them, the silence had become oppressive, suffocating. Every eye in the ballroom was fixed upon them, every face a study in shock, speculation, or barely concealed malice. This was madness. This was social suicide. If she accepted, she would be placing herself at the center of the most scandalous moment of the season, perhaps of the decade. If she refused, she would be rejecting the Duke of Ravenwood, an insult that could destroy what remained of her family's standing. But more than that, buried beneath the layers of practical consideration and learned caution, something in her responded to the steady certainty in his eyes, something that had been dormant for so long she had thought it dead. "The honor," she heard herself say, her voice growing stronger as she placed her trembling hand in his, "would be mine, Your Grace." His fingers closed around hers, firm, warm even through the barrier of their gloves, and a slight smile touched his lips. A real smile, brief as lightning but unmistakable in its genuineness. "Excellent," he murmured, then turned to address the room with a voice that carried effortlessly across the stunned assembly. "I believe the orchestra is waiting." As though released from a spell, the musicians stumbled into the opening bars of the waltz. Edmund Charles led Margaret onto the floor, and the crowd fell back before them like waves receding from the shore. His hand settled at her waist with practiced ease, and suddenly they were moving, sweeping into the pattern of the dance. Margaret, who had not waltzed in years, found her body remembering the steps with surprising grace, guided by his confident lead. "You dance well, Miss Hensley," he observed, his eyes never leaving her face. "Practice, Your Grace," she managed, still struggling to believe this was real, "though it has been some time since I was last invited to—" "Then the gentlemen of London have demonstrated remarkably poor judgment," he interrupted smoothly. "But then, I have long suspected that." Margaret looked up at him sharply, searching his face for mockery, for the cruel amusement that must surely lurk beneath this impossible attention. But his expression remained serious, even grave, as he guided her through a turn. "Your Grace," she began, her voice low and urgent, "I do not understand." "No," he agreed quietly, "not yet. But you will, Miss Hensley. I intend to make myself very clear indeed." The waltz continued, and Margaret felt the weight of 100 hostile gazes upon her back. But for the first time in 20 years, she did not care. For in this moment, held in the arms of the most powerful man in England, she felt something she had thought forever lost. She felt seen. The final notes of the waltz faded into a silence so profound that Margaret could hear the rustle of silk as ladies leaned toward one another, could hear the sharp intake of breath, as speculation transformed into outright gossip. "Did you see?" "Impossible." "She must have." "The Duke cannot possibly—" The whispers erupted like a dam breaking, a deluge of shock and malice that crashed over Margaret with physical force. But the Duke seemed utterly impervious to the storm he had created. His hand remained at her waist a moment longer than strictly proper before he released her, stepping back to execute a formal bow. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Hensley," he said, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "It has been the only bearable moment of this entire tedious evening." Then, before she could formulate a response, before she could even process what he had said, he was gone, moving through the crowd with that same effortless authority, leaving Margaret standing alone at the center of the ballroom, exposed to the full weight of society's judgment. Eleanor materialized at her side within seconds, her face pale with shock. "Margaret, what did he say to you? Everyone is staring. We must leave immediately." But before they could move, Lady Pemberton swept toward them, her expression a masterwork of false concern barely concealing vicious curiosity. "My dear Miss Hensley," she cooed, her voice dripping with poisonous sweetness, "what an unexpected honor for you. Though I must confess, I cannot imagine what prompted His Grace to single you out. Perhaps he mistook you for someone else in the dim light." The barb struck home, echoing Margaret's own doubts so precisely that she felt her brief moment of hope crumbling. "I'm certain there must be some explanation," Margaret replied with hard-won dignity. "If you'll excuse me—" But Lady Pemberton was not finished. "Of course the Duke is known for his eccentricities. Why, just last season, he spent an entire evening discussing agricultural reforms with Lord Hendley, rather than dancing with any of the young ladies. Perhaps he simply wished to observe a social curiosity." The words were chosen with surgical precision, each one designed to cut. Margaret felt Eleanor's hand tighten on her arm, felt the heat rising to her cheeks despite her best efforts at composure. "I'm sure I cannot speak to His Grace's motivations," Margaret managed, her voice admirably steady. "Now, if you'll excuse us—" "But my dear, surely you must have some sense of why—" "Lady Pemberton," Eleanor interrupted, her voice sharp with protective fury. "My sister is feeling unwell. We really must." The rest of Eleanor's words were lost as Margaret finally allowed herself to be led away, through the gauntlet of staring faces and whispered speculations, toward the relative sanctuary of the ladies' retiring room. Once inside, with the door firmly closed against the hostile world beyond, Margaret sank onto a velvet settee, her legs suddenly unreliable. "Margaret," Eleanor knelt before her, taking her hands. What did he say to you? During the dance, what did he say? Margaret closed her eyes, seeing again the intensity of his grey gaze, hearing again the low certainty of his voice. He said. She paused, hardly daring to repeat the words aloud. He said, I have the most intelligent eyes in the room. Eleanor's face transformed with wonder. He said that? Truly? Yes, but Eleanor... Margaret opened her eyes, meeting her sister's gaze. It cannot be real. Men like the Duke of Ravenwood do not notice women like me. They do not single us out for dances. They certainly do not pay us compliments on our intelligence. But he did, Eleanor insisted. Margaret, everyone saw it. There can be no mistaking what happened. That's precisely what terrifies me, Margaret whispered. Don't you see? This must be some sort of... She struggled to find the word, to name the fear clawing at her chest. Some sort of cruel amusement. Perhaps he made a wager with his friends. Perhaps he... No. Eleanor's voice was fierce. I watched his face, Margaret. Whatever else he might be, the Duke of Ravenwood was not mocking you. But Margaret could not allow herself to believe it. 20 years had taught her too well the dangers of hope. Then why, Eleanor? Why would the most eligible man in England, a man who has refused countless beautiful young women with impeccable breeding and substantial dowries, suddenly take notice of a 40-year-old spinster with neither youth nor fortune to recommend her? Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, but was interrupted by the arrival of their middle sister, Catherine, who burst into the room with her face flushed and her expression torn between excitement and concern. The entire ballroom is talking of nothing else, Catherine announced breathlessly. Lady Winfield is insisting that His Grace must have been fulfilling some bizarre social obligation. Lord Hartwell claims he's never seen the Duke show such interest in anyone, and... She paused, her face troubled. And Lady Pemberton is suggesting that you must have employed some sort of artifice to capture his attention. Artifice, Margaret repeated flatly. The word settled over her like a shroud. Of course, society could not accept that the Duke might genuinely find her interesting. There must be some trick, some manipulation, some desperate gambit by a woman past her prime. Don't listen to them, Eleanor said fiercely. They're simply jealous that... That what? Margaret interrupted, her voice sharper than she intended. That I managed one dance with a man so far above my station that the very idea is laughable. Eleanor, be reasonable. By morning this will be the scandal of the season, and I... Her voice cracked despite her best efforts. I will be the object of even more ridicule than before. A heavy silence fell over the small room. In the distance, they could hear the muffled sounds of the ball continuing, music and laughter, and the steady hum of conversation that she knew, with absolute certainty, centered on her humiliation. We should go home, Margaret said finally, rising from the settee with weary dignity. There's nothing more to be gained from remaining here. As they prepared to leave, collecting their wraps and steeling themselves for the gauntlet of hostile faces they would have to traverse, Margaret caught sight of her reflection in one of the gilt-edged mirrors. Her face was pale but composed, her hazel eyes perhaps brighter than usual, whether with unshed tears or that dangerous spark of hope, she could not say. She looked every one of her 40 years, the fine lines at the corners of her eyes and mouth testaments to 2 decades of quiet endurance. The most intelligent eyes in the room, she whispered to her reflection, testing the words, trying to believe them. But belief, she was learning, was far more dangerous than despair. Morning brought no respite from the previous night's tumult. Margaret woke to the sound of rain against her window and the hollow ache of a hope she had been foolish enough to entertain, however briefly. By the time she descended for breakfast, the household was already astir with unusual energy. The butler wore an expression of barely concealed excitement. The housemaid dropped a curtsy so deep it was almost comical, and Eleanor sat at the breakfast table with a letter clutched in her hands, her face a study in wonderment. Margaret, she breathed as soon as her sister entered, there's been a delivery. A delivery? Margaret accepted a cup of tea from the hovering footman, her mind still foggy with troubled sleep. From Hatchard's, Eleanor continued, her voice rising with each word. The bookseller. A package addressed specifically to you, delivered by special messenger before dawn. Margaret's hand froze halfway to her lips. tea sloshing dangerously close to the rim of her cup. Hatchards? But I ordered nothing. It's not from you, Eleanor interrupted, thrusting the letter toward her sister. It's from him. The letter was simple, elegant, written in a bold masculine hand on heavy cream paper bearing the Ravenwood crest. Margaret's fingers trembled as she broke the seal. Asterisk, Miss Hensley. Asterisk. Asterisk, last evening, during our conversation, you mentioned in passing your admiration for the metaphysical poets, particularly the obscure works of Henry Vaughan. I recalled that his complete works were recently published in a limited edition by the Clarendon Press. Asterisk. Asterisk. I took the liberty of acquiring a copy for you. I hope you will accept it not as an imposition, but as a gesture of respect for a mind that clearly appreciates subtlety and depth. Asterisk. Asterisk. Yours in admiration, asterisk. Asterisk. Ravenwood asterisk. The package itself sat in the center of the breakfast table, wrapped in brown paper and twine. With shaking hands, Margaret unwrapped it, to reveal a volume so beautiful it took her breath away, leather-bound, gilt-edged, with Vaughan's name embossed in gold lettering across the spine. She opened it carefully, reverently, to find an inscription on the frontispiece in that same bold hand. Asterisk, for Miss Margaret Hensley, whose intelligence deserves worthy companions. Asterisk. Margaret, Eleanor whispered, her eyes wide. This edition, it's extraordinarily rare. I heard Father mention it months ago. Only 50 copies were printed, and they sold out within days. This must have cost too much, Margaret finished numbly. Far, far too much for a casual gesture. The sisters stared at each other across the breakfast table, the impossible weight of the gift lying between them. He remembered, Margaret said finally, her voice barely audible. During the dance, I mentioned Vaughan only once, in passing, when he asked about my favorite poets. It was the briefest comment, hardly worth noting. But he noted it, Eleanor observed. He remembered it, and he went to considerable effort and expense to— She gestured helplessly at the book. The morning-room door opened, and their mother swept in, still in her dressing gown, her face flushed with a mixture of excitement and concern that Margaret had learned to dread. "Is it true?" Lady Hensley demanded without preamble. "The servants are saying that the Duke of Ravenwood has sent you a gift. Please tell me they're mistaken." "I'm afraid not, Mother," Margaret replied, carefully closing the precious volume. "His Grace was kind enough to—" "Kind?" Her mother's voice rose sharply. "Margaret, this is not kindness. This is— She struggled for words. "This is highly irregular. Gifts of this nature are exchanged between couples engaged in serious courtship, not between—" She stopped abruptly, but the unspoken words hung heavy in the air. "Not between eligible dukes and unmarriageable spinsters." "Mother," Eleanor began defensively, but Lady Hensley held up a silencing hand. "I will not have Margaret's hopes raised by some incomprehensible whim of the Duke's," she said firmly. "Men of his station do not form attachments to women of Margaret's circumstances. Whatever game he is playing, it will end, and when it does, I shall return to exactly where I was before," Margaret interrupted quietly. "I am well aware of my position, Mother. I assure you, I harbour no illusions." But even as she spoke the words, her fingers rested protectively on the leather binding of Vaughan's poems, and some treacherous part of her heart whispered that perhaps, just perhaps, this was not a game at all. The remainder of the morning passed in a haze of speculation and anxiety. Callers began arriving by mid-morning, ostensibly to pay social visits, but in reality to fish for information about the Duke's mysterious attention. Lady Pemberton arrived first, her smile sharp as a blade. "My dear Margaret, such an exciting development, though I must confess I'm somewhat puzzled by His Grace's interest. Have you perhaps some previous acquaintance with the Duke? Some connection through family?" "None whatsoever," Margaret replied with rigid politeness. "How extraordinary," Lady Pemberton continued, her tone suggesting it was anything but positive. "Of course the Duke is known for his eccentricities. Why, I recall last year when he spent an entire garden party discussing philosophy with that elderly scholar from Cambridge. Perhaps he views you as an intellectual curiosity." The barb was expertly delivered, suggesting that Margaret's only value lay in being unusual, a specimen to be studied rather than admired. After Lady Pemberton's departure, a steady stream of visitors continued throughout the day, each one probing delicately or otherwise for information, each one leaving Margaret feeling more exposed and uncertain. By evening, exhausted from maintaining her composure through hours of thinly veiled interrogation, Margaret retreated to her small sitting room with the precious volume of Vaughan's poetry. She opened it carefully, her fingers tracing the inscription, **, whose intelligence deserves worthy companions, **. Is that what you see? She whispered to the absent Duke. Or is this merely the sophisticated cruelty of a man so elevated he cannot comprehend the damage his attention inflicts? The book offered no answer, but as she began to read, losing herself in Vaughan's metaphysical meditations on light and darkness, soul and body, she felt the knot of anxiety in her chest loosening slightly. Whatever the Duke's intentions, whether genuine interest or inexplicable whim, he had given her a gift that spoke directly to her truest self. Not her appearance, not her age, not her social value, her mind. And that perhaps was the most dangerous gift of all. 3 days passed with no further word from the Duke, 3 days during which Margaret alternated between relief and a disappointment she refused to acknowledge. The scandal of their dance had become the season's primary topic of conversation, analysed and dissected in every drawing room in London. On the 4th morning, seeking refuge from the suffocating atmosphere of the house and her mother's barely concealed anxiety, Margaret announced her intention to visit the National Gallery. Alone? Lady Hensley's voice rose in alarm. Margaret, given the current situation, perhaps it would be wiser to remain at home. I shall take Mary as chaperone, Margaret replied firmly. Mother, I cannot become a prisoner in my own home simply because the Duke chose to dance with me. The gallery was blessedly quiet on a Thursday morning, most of society still abed or occupied with morning calls. Margaret dismissed Mary to wait in the entrance hall and made her way toward the less frequented rooms housing the Italian masters. She found sanctuary before a Bellini Madonna, losing herself in the painter's masterful rendering of maternal tenderness and divine grace. The gallery's hush was broken only by the distant echo of footsteps and the occasional cough of an attendant. The Madonna's expression is remarkably complex, a familiar voice observed from behind her. She holds the Christ child with such tenderness, yet there's something almost mournful in her eyes, as though she already knows the suffering that awaits him. Margaret spun around to find Edmund Charles standing a respectful distance away, dressed simply in day clothes that somehow made him seem even more imposing than his formal evening attire. His grey eyes were fixed not on her, but on the painting. Your Grace, she managed, dropping into a curtsy despite her racing heart. I did not expect— I come here often, he interrupted gently, finally turning his gaze to her face. When society becomes unbearable, which I confess is frequently. He gestured toward the painting. This particular work has always moved me. Bellini understood that love and loss are inseparable, that to love anything is to accept inevitably its eventual absence. Margaret stared at him, caught off balance by the philosophical depth of his observation. That's remarkably bleak, Your Grace. Is it? He moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could detect that subtle scent of sandalwood again. I've always found it strangely comforting. If loss is inevitable, then perhaps the meaning lies not in avoiding it, but in choosing what or whom we allow ourselves to love, despite that certainty. The words settled over Margaret like a revelation. For 20 years, she had protected herself from hope, from attachment, from the risk of further disappointment. She had chosen the certainty of loneliness over the possibility of loss. You speak as one well acquainted with loss, Your Grace, she said quietly. His expression shifted, revealing for just a moment something raw and unguarded. My father died when I was 19, too young to be Duke, too young to bear the weight of everything the title demanded. I watched him suffer for months, watched him diminish day by day, and I was powerless to prevent it. I'm sorry, Margaret whispered, the inadequate words all she could offer. He shook his head slightly. I tell you this not to solicit sympathy, but to explain something. After my father's death, I retreated into duty. I became the Duke rather than remaining Edmund Charles, who happened to hold a title. I perfected the art of keeping everyone at a distance, of making myself invulnerable to further loss. He turned to face her fully, his grey eyes intense with something that might have been pain or hope, or perhaps both at once. And then, at yet another interminable ball, I saw you standing by that pillar, alone, watchful, refusing to retreat despite the cruelty directed toward you, and I thought, he paused, seeming to choose his words with care. I thought, here is someone who understands what it means to maintain dignity in the face of relentless diminishment. Margaret felt her breath catch. Your Grace, Do you know what I find most intolerable about society, Miss Hensley? He continued, his voice low and fervent. The superficiality, the obsession with appearance over substance, the reduction of complex human beings to their most immediately marketable qualities, youth, beauty, fortune, breeding, as though these attributes could possibly indicate character or depth or worth. Society must have some measures, Margaret heard herself reply, though her mind reeled from his words. Must it? His tone sharpened. Must we accept that a woman's value decreases with each passing year while a man's supposedly increases? Must we pretend that youth equates to wisdom or beauty to virtue? Must we ignore intelligence and resilience and strength of character simply because they cannot be easily categorized and commodified? The passion in his voice was unmistakable, and Margaret found herself responding to it despite her ingrained caution. You are describing an entirely different social order, Your Grace. One that does not exist. Not yet, he agreed, but Miss Hensley, surely you of all people must chafe against the arbitrary cruelty of the current system. You, who possess more intelligence and genuine grace than the past 5 seasons worth of debutantes combined, are dismissed as worthless because you have the audacity to be 40 rather than 20. The bluntness of the statement should have wounded her. Instead, she felt a strange liberation in hearing her situation named so directly. Yes, she admitted quietly. Yes, I chafe against it. But Your Grace, chafing against injustice and being able to change it are entirely different matters. I am one woman with no power, no influence, no ability to alter the fundamental structures that— You are Margaret Hensley, he interrupted firmly. A woman who has endured 2 decades of systematic dismissal without losing her dignity or her capacity for intellectual engagement. A woman who speaks honestly rather than strategically. A woman who— He stopped abruptly, seeming to catch himself before revealing too much. They stood in silence for a long moment, the Bellini Madonna gazing down at them with her mournful, knowing eyes. Why did you give me Vaughan's poetry? Margaret asked finally, voicing the question that had haunted her for 3 days. Edmund's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Because you mentioned it. Because it mattered to you. Because in a world obsessed with meaningless gestures and calculated displays, I wanted to offer you something genuine, something that honored who you actually are rather than who society wishes you to be. But Your Grace, Margaret struggled to articulate the fear clawing at her throat. Your attention, your gifts, they place me in an impossible position. If your interest is genuine, it defies all logic and social convention. If it is not— Her voice cracked despite her best efforts. If it is not, then I am the object of the most elaborate and cruel joke ever perpetrated by a member of the peerage. Edmund's face transformed with something that looked remarkably like anguish. Miss Hensley, I assure you this is no joke. My interest is— He paused, and when he continued, his voice was raw with honesty. My interest is perhaps the most genuine feeling I have experienced in nearly 20 years. Margaret stared at him, her world tilting on its axis. This could not be real. And yet, looking into his eyes, she saw no mockery, no calculation, only a vulnerability that mirrored her own. I don't understand, she whispered. Neither do I, he admitted. Not entirely. I only know that I have spent years in the company of society's most celebrated women and felt nothing but profound boredom. And then I spent one dance with you and felt— He stopped, shook his head. Alive, Miss Hensley. I felt alive. Before she could respond, voices echoed from the adjacent gallery, signaling the approach of other visitors. Edmund stepped back immediately, restoring proper distance between them. I should go, he said formally. But Miss Hensley, might I, that is, would you permit me to call upon you, formally, at your home?" Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. A formal call was a declaration of intent, a public acknowledgement that he was courting her. It would transform their tentative connection into acknowledged fact. "Yes," she heard herself say. "Yes, Your Grace, you may call." His face lit with a smile so genuine, so unguarded, that it transformed his austere features entirely. "Tomorrow afternoon, then, at 3 o'clock?" "I shall be home," she confirmed, her voice steadier than she felt. He bowed deeply, then departed before the other visitors could round the corner and discover them together. Margaret remained before the Bellini Madonna, her mind whirling with the impossibility of what had just transpired. The Madonna gazed down at her with those mournful, knowing eyes, and Margaret thought she understood now what Edmund had meant. Love and loss were inseparable. To open oneself to one was to risk the other. The only question was whether she possessed the courage to make that choice. The note arrived at precisely 9 o'clock the following morning, delivered by a Ravenwood footman in full livery, whose presence at the Hensley residence door caused the housemaid to nearly drop her tray. Margaret accepted it with trembling fingers, immediately recognizing the bold hand and the Ravenwood crest pressed into the wax seal. She waited until she had retreated to the privacy of her sitting room before breaking the seal. Asterisk. Miss Hensley. Asterisk. Asterisk. With your permission, I should like to call upon you this afternoon at 3 o'clock as previously discussed. I trust this timing remains convenient. Asterisk. Asterisk, I wish to speak with you candidly about matters of consequence. I hope you will grant me the courtesy of a private audience, within the bounds of propriety. Asterisk. Asterisk. Yours. Asterisk. Asterisk. Ravenwood asterisk. The formality of the language could not disguise the weight of what he was proposing. A private call, matters of consequence. These were the phrases of courtship, of serious intent. Margaret sank into her chair, the note clutched against her chest. This was madness. This was impossible, and yet it was happening, as real and undeniable as the paper in her hands. "Margaret?" Eleanor's voice came from the doorway, followed immediately by her sister's anxious face. "Was that a Ravenwood footman I saw leaving? Is everything well?" "He's coming," Margaret said numbly. "This afternoon. He wishes to speak with me about matters of consequence." Eleanor's face transformed with a mixture of joy and terror. "Margaret, do you understand what this means? If the Duke is making a formal call, if he's requesting private conversation—" "I know what it means," Margaret interrupted, her voice sharper than intended. "Eleanor, I know precisely what it means, and I cannot comprehend why it is happening." Her sister crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, taking Margaret's free hand. "Perhaps you should simply accept that it is happening, that you are worthy of it happening." "Worthy," Margaret repeated bitterly. "Eleanor, I am 40 years old. I have no fortune, no particular beauty, no accomplishments that a dozen younger women could not surpass. By what measure am I worthy of the Duke of Ravenwood's attention?" "By the measure that matters to him," Eleanor replied firmly. "Margaret, he sees something in you that society has been too blind to recognize. Why is that so difficult to believe?" Before Margaret could answer, their mother appeared in the doorway, her face pale with a mixture of excitement and anxiety that had become her constant expression over the past week. "Eleanor, leave us," Lady Hensley commanded. "I must speak with your sister privately." Once they were alone, Lady Hensley closed the door and turned to face Margaret with an expression of desperate concern. "Margaret, I must speak plainly. This attention from the Duke, it has gone too far. If he makes a formal call this afternoon, if he declares himself, you must consider very carefully before accepting." Margaret stared at her mother in disbelief. "Mother, are you suggesting I refuse the Duke of Ravenwood?" "I am suggesting that you protect yourself," Lady Hensley said urgently. "My dear, I have watched you endure 20 years of subtle cruelties. I have seen you maintain your dignity in the face of society's dismissal. And now, when the most eligible man in England inexplicably singles you out, I see that old hope rekindling in your eyes, and it terrifies me." "Mother, because when this ends, Margaret, and it will end. You will be more exposed, more vulnerable than ever before. The fall from this height will destroy you in ways that simple spinsterhood never could." The words struck with devastating accuracy, voicing the fears Margaret had been fighting to suppress. "You think he will withdraw his interest?" she said flatly. "I think he is a duke who has lived his entire life with unlimited choices and no consequences," Lady Hensley replied. "I think that what seems like genuine interest now may prove to be merely a passing fascination, and I think that you, my darling girl, will pay the price when his fascination fades." Margaret rose from her chair, her hands clenched at her sides. "So I should refuse him? Send him away? Return to my quiet invisibility?" "I'm saying you should be cautious. Protect your heart." "My heart has been protected for 20 years, Mother," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "And what has that protection gained me? Safety, yes, but also a life so constrained, so diminished, that I sometimes wonder if I truly live at all." Lady Hensley's face crumpled with pain. "I only wish to spare you suffering." "Life is suffering," Margaret interrupted, echoing Edmund's philosophy from their conversation at the gallery. "The only choice we have is what we allow ourselves to love, despite that certainty." Asterisk. Meanwhile, across London in the imposing townhouse of Ravenwood, asterisk. Edmund Charles stood before the windows of his private study, his posture rigid with determination, as he faced his mother, the Dowager Duchess of Ravenwood. "You cannot be serious, Edmund." The Dowager's voice was cold with aristocratic disdain. "Miss Hensley, a woman of 40 with no fortune, no beauty, and no connections beyond a minor county family." "I am entirely serious, Mother," Edmund replied, his tone brooking no argument. "I intend to call upon Miss Hensley this afternoon, and if she accepts my suit, which is by no means certain, I intend to marry her." The Dowager rose from her chair, her silk gown rustling with agitation. "This is absurd. You have refused a dozen perfectly suitable young ladies, women with impeccable breeding, substantial dowries, and the youth to provide you with heirs. And now you propose to throw yourself away on a spinster past her prime. I propose to marry a woman of extraordinary intelligence, dignity, and character." Edmund corrected sharply, "qualities rather more substantial than youth or beauty, which inevitably fade." "But the scandal, Edmund, the talk. The Duke of Ravenwood marrying a woman society considers unmarriageable. It will be the sensation of the decade. Your reputation—" "My reputation," Edmund interrupted, his voice dangerously quiet, "has been built on refusing to compromise my principles for society's approval. I see no reason to begin doing so now." The Dowager stared at her son, genuine bewilderment crossing her aristocratic features. "But why her, Edmund? What could this woman possibly offer you that countless others could not?" Edmund turned to face his mother fully, and for a moment his careful composure cracked, revealing the depth of feeling beneath. "She sees me, Mother. Not the Duke, not the title, not the fortune. Me, Edmund Charles, the man I am beneath all the trappings of rank and power." "That's absurd," the Dowager scoffed. "Everyone sees you." "No," Edmund said firmly. "They see Ravenwood. They see what they can gain from an alliance with me. They see a title and a fortune walking about in human form. But Miss Hensley," his voice softened almost imperceptibly, "when she looks at me, I feel seen as I have not been seen since Father died." The Dowager was silent for a long moment, her face working through a complex series of emotions. "And if I refuse to accept her, if I make my opposition known, then you will drive a wedge between us that may never be repaired," Edmund replied quietly. "Mother, I have been a dutiful son. I have managed the estates responsibly. I have fulfilled every obligation expected of my position, but in the choice of who will share my life, I must follow my own judgment. Even if it means social ruin?" "Even then," Edmund confirmed, "though I suspect society's memory is shorter than you credit. Within a year, there will be some new scandal to occupy them, and Miss Hensley will simply be the Duchess of Ravenwood. A position, I might add, that she will fill with more grace and genuine nobility than any of the vapid debutantes you would have preferred." The Dowager studied her son's face, seeing there a resolve she recognized from her late husband. "You truly love her," she said finally, her voice softening with reluctant wonder. "I do," Edmund admitted, "though I have only begun to understand the depth of that feeling myself." A long silence fell between them. Finally, the dowager sighed, her rigid posture relaxing slightly. "Then I suppose I must learn to accept her, though I warn you, Edmund, society will not be so easily won over." "Society can go hang," Edmund replied calmly. "I learned long ago that living for others' approval is a certain path to misery. I intend to live for my own happiness and hers. If society eventually accepts us, well and good. If not," he shrugged with aristocratic indifference, "I have estates enough that we need never set foot in London again." The dowager managed a slight smile despite herself. "You have your father's stubbornness. He too married for love rather than advantage, you know. My family thought he was mad to choose a mere baron's daughter, when he could have had his pick of the highest-born ladies in England." "And yet you were happy," Edmund observed softly. "We were," the dowager admitted. "Extraordinarily happy for the too brief time we had together." Her expression turned thoughtful. "Perhaps you are wiser than I credited, my son. Love is rare enough that when one finds it, only a fool would let it slip away for the sake of society's approval." Edmund crossed to his mother and kissed her cheek gently. "Thank you, Mother. Your blessing means more than you know." "I have not quite given my blessing yet," the dowager corrected, but her tone was gentler now. "I reserve judgment until I have met this extraordinary Miss Hensley, who has accomplished what no other woman could, capturing the heart of the most determinedly unattainable bachelor in England." After his mother departed, Edmund returned to the window, gazing out at the grey London sky. In a few hours he would call upon Margaret Hensley. He would declare his intentions clearly and honestly, and he would place his heart so carefully guarded for so many years entirely in her hands. The risk was enormous. She might refuse him. She might, despite everything, believe his interest to be some elaborate joke. But the alternative, retreating into the cold, lonely safety he had maintained for nearly 2 decades, was no longer bearable. Margaret Hensley had awakened something in him that he had thought permanently dormant, and whatever the cost, whatever scandal might follow, he could not let her go. At precisely 3 o'clock the Ravenwood carriage drew up before the Hensley residence. Edmund descended with deliberate calm, though his heart thundered against his ribs with uncharacteristic nervousness. The Hensley butler admitted him immediately, his aged face carefully neutral despite the unprecedented nature of the Duke of Ravenwood, making a formal call upon Miss Margaret Hensley. Edmund was shown into the drawing-room, a comfortable, well-appointed space that spoke of genteel respectability rather than wealth. Margaret rose as he entered, and for a moment Edmund simply looked at her. She wore a gown of deep forest green that brought out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes. Her auburn hair, streaked with distinguished silver, was arranged in a simple but elegant style. She was not beautiful by society's narrow standards, but to him she was luminous with intelligence and quiet dignity. "Your Grace," she said, her voice admirably steady as she curtsied, "you honor my home with your presence." "The honor is mine, Miss Hensley," he replied, bowing. "Thank you for receiving me." Eleanor sat in the corner as propriety demanded, her presence a silent reminder that they were not truly alone. But Edmund had anticipated this, had prepared his words for an audience. "Miss Hensley," he began, remaining standing as formality required, "I wish to speak with you candidly about my intentions, as I believe clarity serves us both better than artful ambiguity." Margaret's hands clasped tightly in her lap, but her gaze remained steady on his face. "I appreciate candor, Your Grace. Since our dance at the Rutland Ball," Edmund continued, "I have been deliberate in my attentions toward you. The gift of Vaughan's poetry, our meeting at the National Gallery, and now this formal call, these are not casual gestures, Miss Hensley. They are the actions of a man pursuing courtship with serious intent." He heard Eleanor's sharp intake of breath from the corner, but his focus remained fixed on Margaret's face, watching for her reaction. "Your Grace," Margaret said carefully, "I must confess to profound confusion about your interest. You are aware, I'm certain, of my circumstances. I am 40 years old, without beauty, fortune, or any particular accomplishment. By every measure society employs, I am thoroughly unsuitable as a potential wife for a man of your station." "By society's measures, perhaps," Edmund agreed, "but I have never been one to value society's measures particularly highly. May I?" He gestured toward the chair opposite hers. At her nod, he sat, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, his posture more intimate than formal. "Miss Hensley, I am going to tell you something I have told very few people. When my father died and I inherited the dukedom at 19, I was utterly unprepared. I retreated into duty, into the role of duke, because it was safer than remaining vulnerable as merely Edmund Charles." Margaret's expression softened with understanding, but she remained silent, allowing him to continue. "For nearly 20 years I have maintained that distance. I have refused every attempt at matchmaking because the women presented to me, however lovely, however accomplished, were interested only in the duke. They saw a title, a fortune, a position, not a man with hopes and fears and a desperate longing for genuine connection." He paused, gathering his courage for the most honest statement he had ever made. "And then I saw you, standing by that pillar at the Rutland ball, alone, watchful, refusing to retreat despite the cruelty directed at you. And I thought, here is someone who understands what it means to be seen as a symbol rather than a person. Here is someone who might understand me." "Your Grace," Margaret began, but he held up a gentle hand. "Please let me finish. During our dance, during our conversation at the gallery, every moment we have spent together has confirmed my initial impression. You speak to me as Edmund, not as Ravenwood. You challenge my thoughts rather than simply agreeing with everything I say. You possess a depth of character and intelligence that I find—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Essential, necessary. Unlike anything I have encountered in 20 years of moving through society." Margaret's eyes had grown bright with unshed tears, but her voice remained steady. "But Your Grace, surely you must see the impossibility of what you're suggesting, the scandal alone." "I do not seek a bride to avoid scandal, Miss Hensley," Edmund interrupted gently but firmly. "I seek a partner for my soul. Someone with whom I can be fully myself, without the armor I've worn for so long. Someone whose presence brings me peace rather than obligation." He leaned forward even further, his grey eyes intense with emotion. "You speak of your age as though it diminishes your value. I see it differently. Your 40 years have given you wisdom, resilience, perspective, qualities infinitely more valuable than youth. You have endured 2 decades of systematic dismissal without becoming bitter or cruel. That strength of character is precisely what I need beside me." "Edmund?" The use of his given name slipped out before Margaret could stop it, and she flushed with embarrassment. But Edmund's face lit with joy at the sound. "Yes," he said softly, "Edmund. Not Your Grace, not Ravenwood, just Edmund. That is what I offer you, Margaret, if I may use your given name as well. Not the Duke of Ravenwood with all his wealth and position, but the man beneath the title. A man who is far less certain and far more vulnerable than the world sees." Margaret's composure finally cracked, a single tear sliding down her cheek. "You cannot possibly understand what you're asking of me. To believe this is real, to trust in it, and then to have it prove false, it would destroy me utterly." Edmund moved without conscious thought, abandoning his chair to kneel before hers, taking her trembling hands in his own. Behind them, Eleanor gasped at the impropriety, but Edmund paid no heed. "Then let me be absolutely clear," he said, his voice low and fervent. "I, Edmund Charles, Duke of Ravenwood, wish to court you, Margaret Hensley, with the intention of making you my wife, not despite your age, but treasuring the wisdom it represents. Not despite your circumstances, but honoring the dignity with which you have borne them. I am not playing a game. I am not amusing myself. I am offering you my heart, such as it is, with all its careful protections finally stripped away." Margaret stared down at him, this powerful man kneeling before her like a supplicant, and felt the last of her defenses crumbling. "I'm terrified," she whispered. "So am I," Edmund admitted. "I have not allowed myself to feel anything this deeply in nearly 20 years. It is profoundly unsettling, but Margaret," his hands tightened on hers, "I would rather face that fear with you than retreat into safe loneliness without you." For a long moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock and Eleanor's barely suppressed weeping in the corner. Finally, Margaret spoke, her voice trembling but clear. If, and I emphasize, if I were to accept your courtship, Edmund, you must understand what you are inviting into your life. Society will be merciless. Your mother will likely oppose the match. Your friends may question your judgment. And I, her voice caught. I come with no advantages, no connections, nothing but myself. Yourself? Edmund repeated, rising to sit beside her on the settee, maintaining her hands in his. Is everything I want, everything I need. Let society be merciless. Let my mother oppose it, though I confess she has already indicated she will come to accept you. Let my friends question me. None of it matters, Margaret, if I have you. Margaret looked at their joined hands, his strong and elegant, hers trembling and uncertain. Then she raised her eyes to meet his, and Edmund saw in their hazel depths the same vulnerable hope he felt in his own heart. Then yes, she said softly. Yes, Edmund, I accept your courtship, and I will try, God help me, I will try to believe that this is real. Edmund's face transformed with a smile of such unguarded joy that it took years from his austere features. Thank you, he breathed. Thank you for trusting me, for taking this risk. I promise you, Margaret, I will spend every day proving myself worthy of that trust. From the corner, Eleanor openly wept with happiness, but Margaret and Edmund remained focused entirely on each other, their hands still joined, their eyes locked in a moment of perfect understanding. The truth had been revealed, spoken aloud and accepted. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. News of the Duke's formal courtship spread through London with the speed of wildfire through dry timber. By the following morning, every drawing room in the city buzzed with speculation, shock, and in many cases, outright hostility. Margaret woke to find her household in a state of unusual agitation. The Morning Post had brought no fewer than 15 letters, some offering congratulations tinged with disbelief, others barely concealing their malicious curiosity, and a few openly warning her that the Duke's interest could not possibly be genuine. But it was the letter that arrived at mid-morning, delivered by special messenger, that truly disrupted the fragile peace Margaret had been trying to maintain. Margaret. Eleanor entered her sister's sitting room with an expression of deep concern. A letter has arrived from Thomas. Margaret's heart sank. Thomas Hensley, their elder brother and head of the family since their father's death 5 years prior, had been travelling on the continent and had only just returned to England. His opinion carried considerable weight in family matters, and Margaret had been dreading his reaction to the news. She broke the seal with trembling fingers. Asterisk, Margaret. Asterisk. Asterisk, I have returned to London to discover that in my absence you have become the subject of the most extraordinary scandal. The Duke of Ravenwood? Margaret, this is madness. I am arriving at the house this afternoon at 2 o'clock. We must discuss this matter immediately. Asterisk. Asterisk. Your concerned brother. Asterisk. Asterisk. Thomas Asterisk. He's angry, Margaret said quietly, passing the letter to Eleanor. He's protective, Eleanor corrected gently. Thomas has always worried about you, especially after... She stopped, leaving unspoken the memory of a failed courtship in Margaret's youth that had left her heartbroken and wary. At precisely 2 o'clock, Thomas Hensley arrived, his face set in lines of stern concern. He was a handsome man of 45, prosperous and respected, with the bearing of one accustomed to managing both estates and family affairs. Margaret, he greeted her formally, kissing her cheek with more duty than warmth. Mother, Eleanor, I trust you are all well. The pleasantries were perfunctory, quickly abandoned, as Thomas turned to face Margaret with undisguised worry. Now then, Margaret, I must speak plainly. This business with the Duke of Ravenwood, what precisely is transpiring? His Grace has declared his intention to court me, Margaret replied, lifting her chin with the dignity she had perfected over 20 years, with the aim of matrimony. Thomas's expression darkened. Margaret, you are my sister, and I love you dearly, but you must be sensible about this. The Duke of Ravenwood is one of the most powerful men in England. His wealth is incomprehensible, his lineage impeccable. Why would such a man suddenly develop an interest in... He stopped abruptly, In a 40-year-old spinster, with no fortune and no particular recommendation. Margaret finished for him, her voice cold. Yes, Thomas, I am well aware of the apparent absurdity of the situation. I did not mean to wound you, Thomas said, his tone softening slightly. But Margaret, you must see reason. Men of the Duke's station do not form genuine attachments to women in your circumstances. There must be some other explanation, a wager among his friends perhaps, or some incomprehensible whim that will pass as quickly as it arrived. Thomas! Eleanor protested, but Margaret held up a silencing hand. You believe he's playing a cruel game with me, Margaret said flatly. I believe he is a duke who has lived his entire life with unlimited power and no consequences, Thomas replied. I believe he may not fully comprehend the damage his attention inflicts upon you. And I believe that when his interest inevitably fades, you will be left more exposed and vulnerable than ever before. The words echoed her mother's warnings, her own deepest fears. But before Margaret could formulate a response, the butler appeared at the drawing-room door. Your pardon, Mr. Hensley, but His Grace, the Duke of Ravenwood, has called. He wishes to speak with you specifically, sir. Thomas's eyebrows rose in surprise. He's here, now? He indicated the matter was of some urgency, sir. Thomas glanced at Margaret, his expression unreadable. Very well, show him to the library. I shall meet him there. He turned back to his sister. Margaret, please remain here. I wish to speak with His Grace privately. In the library, Edmund waited with the patient stillness of a man accustomed to command. He had anticipated this confrontation, had indeed requested it. If he was to marry Margaret Hensley, he would need to convince her family that his intentions were honourable. Thomas Hensley entered with the bearing of a man prepared for battle. Your Grace, he said, bowing with correct but cool courtesy. This is an unexpected visit. Mr. Hensley, Edmund replied, returning the bow with equal formality. I appreciate your willingness to see me. I understand you have concerns about my courtship of your sister. I wish to address them directly. Thomas's expression remained guarded. Forgive my bluntness, Your Grace, but yes, I have considerable concerns. My sister has endured 20 years of subtle cruelties from society. She has maintained her dignity despite constant dismissal, and now, when the most eligible man in England suddenly singles her out for attention, I fear for what will happen when that attention inevitably fades. You assume my interest will fade, Edmund observed calmly. With respect, Your Grace, your history suggests it. You have refused countless eligible young ladies over the years. Why should I believe that my sister, who by society's measures is thoroughly unsuitable, will hold your interest where countless others have failed? Edmund moved to stand before the library windows, his hands clasped behind his back. Mr. Hensley, I am going to tell you something that very few people know. After my father died, I inherited the dukedom at 19 years old. I was utterly unprepared for the responsibility, the scrutiny, the endless demands of the position. He turned back to face Thomas. I watched my father suffer and die, watched him diminish day by day, and I was powerless to prevent it. After his death, I built walls around myself, walls of duty, of formality, of emotional distance. I became the Duke of Ravenwood, rather than remaining Edmund Charles, who happened to hold a title. I fail to see what this has to do with Margaret, Thomas said, though his tone had softened slightly. It has everything to do with her, Edmund replied firmly. For nearly 20 years I have moved through society like a ghost in my own life. I have performed my duties, managed my estates, fulfilled every obligation expected of my position, but I have felt nothing, Mr. Hensley. Nothing but a vast, cold emptiness where genuine human connection should exist. He paused, his grey eyes intense with emotion. And then I saw your sister at the Rutland ball, standing alone, enduring whispered cruelties with quiet dignity, refusing to retreat or diminish herself despite society's judgment. And for the first time in 20 years, I felt something stir in that cold emptiness. I felt recognition, understanding, hope. Thomas's expression had shifted from hostility to uncertainty. Your Grace, I have refused countless young ladies, Edmund continued, because they wanted the Duke of Ravenwood. They wanted the title, the fortune, the position. Not one of them ever looked at me and saw Edmund Charles a man with fears and hopes and desperate loneliness beneath all the trappings of rank. His voice dropped, becoming more intimate. Your sister sees me, Mr. Hensley, not the Duke, but the man. She speaks to me honestly rather than strategically. She challenges my thoughts rather than simply reflecting them back to me. In her presence, I feel like a complete human being rather than merely a collection of duties and obligations. Thomas was silent for a long moment, studying the Duke's face with new attention. You truly care for her, he said finally, wonder creeping into his voice. I love her, Edmund replied simply, though I am only beginning to understand the depth of that feeling myself. And Mr. Hensley, I intend to marry her, with or without your blessing. But I would prefer to have it, for Margaret's sake, if not my own. The scandal will be enormous, Thomas warned. Society will be merciless to her. Society has already been merciless to her for 20 years, Edmund countered sharply. At least now she will face their judgment with the protection of my name and position, and I assure you, Mr. Hensley, I am more than capable of defending my wife against society's cruelty. Your wife, Thomas repeated, the reality of the situation settling over him. You truly intend to make Margaret the Duchess of Ravenwood? I do, Edmund confirmed, and I believe she will fill that role with more genuine grace and nobility than any of the vapid debutantes society would prefer. Thomas moved to the library sideboard and poured 2 glasses of brandy, offering one to Edmund. Your Grace, I must be frank with you. Margaret has suffered deeply from society's dismissal. She has built walls around her heart as surely as you have built walls around yours. If you are offering her hope only to withdraw it later— I will not withdraw it, Edmund interrupted firmly. Mr. Hensley, I am 38 years old. I have had nearly 20 years to choose a bride from among England's finest families. I have refused them all because none of them touched my heart. Your sister has accomplished in one dance what no other woman has managed in 2 decades. She has made me feel truly alive. He set down his untouched brandy and faced Thomas squarely. I understand your doubts. I understand your protective instinct. But I give you my word as a gentleman and as a duke, I will honor your sister, protect her, and treasure her for as long as I draw breath. She will never have cause to doubt my devotion or regret accepting my suit. Thomas studied the Duke's face for a long moment, searching for any hint of insincerity or doubt. Finding none, he finally extended his hand. Then you have my blessing, Your Grace, he said quietly. Though I warn you, if you hurt my sister, title or no title, you will answer to me. Edmund gripped his hand firmly, a slight smile touching his austere features. I would expect nothing less, Mr. Hensley. A woman fortunate enough to inspire such loyalty in her family is a woman worth treasuring. When Margaret was summoned to the library 20 minutes later, she entered with her heart in her throat, prepared for the worst. But the sight that met her eyes stopped her in her tracks. Thomas and Edmund stood together before the fireplace, brandy glasses in hand, engaged in what appeared to be earnest conversation. Both men turned as she entered, and the expressions on their faces, Thomas's cautious approval, Edmund's open relief, told her everything she needed to know. Margaret, Thomas said, crossing to embrace her warmly, I have given His Grace my blessing to court you. More than that, he pulled back to look into her face. I have given him my approval to seek your hand in marriage, should you be willing. Margaret's eyes filled with tears despite her best efforts. Thomas, I was wrong to doubt him, her brother continued. Or rather, I was wrong to doubt you. If you believe his intentions are genuine, if you trust him with your heart, then that is enough for me. He kissed her forehead gently. Be happy, sister. God knows you deserve it more than anyone I know. After Thomas departed, Margaret found herself alone with Edmund for the first time since his declaration the previous day. He approached her slowly, giving her time to retreat if she wished, then took her hands gently in his own. Your brother is formidable, he observed with a slight smile. I can see where you inherited your strength of character. He was protecting me, Margaret said softly, as he always has. As I intend to do for the rest of my life, Edmund replied. Margaret, I want you to understand something. I do not offer you my protection because I think you weak or in need of rescue. I offer it because you have stood alone against society's cruelties for far too long. You need never stand alone again. Margaret looked up into his face, this powerful man who had somehow seen value in her when the world saw only deficit, and felt the last of her doubts crumbling. "I believe you," she whispered. "Edmund, I believe you." His smile transformed his entire face, and he raised her hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to each one. "That is all I ask, my dear. Your trust, your faith, and in time, if I am very fortunate, your love." "You may have that already," Margaret admitted, her cheeks flushing with the confession. Edmund's breath caught, his grey eyes darkening with emotion. "Margaret, I know it is too soon," she continued quickly. "I know I should be more cautious, more guarded. But Edmund, you have awakened something in me that I thought had died years ago. Hope, joy, the belief that I am worthy of love. How can I not love the man who gave me those gifts?" For a moment, Edmund simply stood frozen, as though afraid to believe what he had heard. Then, with a tenderness that belied his imposing stature, he drew her into his arms, holding her against his chest as though she were infinitely precious. "My dear Margaret," he murmured against her hair, "my brave, beautiful Margaret, you have given me gifts far beyond measure. You have given me back myself." They stood together in the quiet library, two people who had spent decades protecting their hearts, finally allowing those carefully maintained defenses to fall away. Whatever storms might come, they would face them together. The afternoon was unseasonably warm for early spring, the sky a brilliant blue unmarred by clouds. Edmund had arranged for a private excursion to the Duke of Devonshire's gardens at Chiswick, a place of renowned beauty that was, conveniently, closed to the general public, but accessible to those with sufficient rank and influence. Margaret sat beside him in the Ravenwood carriage, acutely aware of Eleanor's presence across from them, serving as chaperone. The propriety must be maintained, even as their courtship deepened into something that felt inevitable, predestined. "I thought you might appreciate the gardens," Edmund said quietly, his eyes on her face rather than the passing scenery. "They have a remarkable collection of camellias that should be at their peak." "You are very thoughtful," Margaret replied, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to disguise their trembling. Despite Thomas's blessing, despite Edmund's repeated assurances, despite her own growing certainty about his sincerity, a part of her remained terrified that this dream would shatter. The gardens proved even more beautiful than promised. Ancient trees spread their branches over carefully tended paths. Early spring flowers bloomed in carefully orchestrated profusion, and the camellias, hundreds of them, created a riot of pink, white, and red against the dark, glossy green of their leaves. Edmund dismissed the footman to wait at a discreet distance, then offered Margaret his arm. Eleanor, understanding the unspoken request for privacy within the bounds of propriety, fell back several paces, far enough to maintain decorum but close enough to serve as chaperone. They walked in companionable silence for some time, simply enjoying the beauty around them and each other's presence. But Margaret felt the weight of unspoken fears pressing against her chest, demanding to be voiced. "Edmund," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "I must speak plainly with you about something that has been troubling me." He stopped walking immediately, turning to face her with concern evident in his grey eyes. "Of course, you know you may speak to me about anything." Margaret took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "You are 38, I am 40. If we marry," she stumbled over the word, still unable to fully believe it might come to pass. "If we marry, you will still be in your prime while I continue to age. In 5 years I will be 45. In 10, 50. And you," her voice cracked despite her best efforts, "you will still be relatively young, still handsome, still vital. And I fear—" She stopped, unable to continue, but Edmund's expression had shifted to understanding tinged with pain. "You fear that I will come to regret my choice," he finished for her quietly. "That I will look at you in 5 or 10 years and see only your age, that I will wish I had chosen one of the young beauties society offered me." "Yes," Margaret whispered, tears beginning to slip down her cheeks despite her desperate attempts to contain them. "Edmund, I have spent 20 years being dismissed as too old, too plain, too unmarriageable. I cannot—" her voice broke. "I cannot bear the thought of seeing that same dismissal in your eyes." of watching your love fade as my youth, what little remains of it disappears entirely. Edmund stood very still for a moment, his face working through a complex series of emotions. Then, with deliberate care, he took both her hands in his and led her to a stone bench partially concealed by a magnificent camellia bush heavy with white blooms. "Sit with me," he said gently. "Please, Margaret, I need to tell you something." Once they were seated, Edmund turned to face her fully, his hands still clasping hers, his grey eyes intense with emotion. "2 weeks ago," he began, his voice low and fervent, "I was the most isolated man in England. I had wealth, power, position, everything society deems valuable. But I was utterly, profoundly alone, Margaret. I moved through my days like a ghost, performing my duties with mechanical precision, feeling nothing, wanting nothing, simply existing rather than truly living." He raised one hand to gently wipe the tears from her cheeks, his touch infinitely tender. "And then I saw you, 40 years old as you keep reminding me, standing alone in a ballroom, enduring whispered cruelties with quiet dignity, refusing to disappear despite society's judgment. And do you know what I thought?" Margaret shook her head mutely. "I thought, here is someone who understands. Here is someone who has endured isolation and emerged with their character intact. Here is someone who knows what it means to be truly alone, yet refuses to become bitter or diminished by that loneliness." His voice dropped even lower, becoming almost reverent. "Your 40 years are not a liability, Margaret. They are your strength. They are what have shaped you into the woman you are, a woman of extraordinary resilience, dignity, and depth of character. Do you truly believe I value those qualities less than youth? That I would trade the wisdom in your eyes for the empty prettiness of a 20-year-old debutante?" But Edmund— "No," he interrupted gently but firmly. "Listen to me, please. I have spent 20 years in the company of young beauties. I have danced with countless debutantes in the first bloom of their youth. I have been surrounded by women society deems perfect specimens, and I felt nothing, Margaret. Nothing but an endless, crushing boredom punctuated by desperate loneliness." He took her face between his hands, forcing her to meet his intense gaze. "One dance with you, one conversation awakened more in me than 2 decades among society's finest. You speak of your age as though it diminishes you. I see it as the foundation upon which everything I love about you has been built." "You say that now," Margaret whispered, "but in 5 years, 10 years, in 5 years you will be 45 and I will love you more deeply than I do today," Edmund interrupted with quiet certainty. "In 10 years you will be 50, and I will thank God every morning that you chose to trust me with your heart. Margaret, I am not choosing you despite your age. I am choosing you in part because of it." He released her face but kept hold of her hands, his thumbs tracing gentle patterns on her skin. "Do you know what terrifies me? Not that you will age, we will both age, my dear. That is the nature of life. What terrifies me is the thought of living the rest of my days without you, of retreating back into that cold isolation because I was too foolish or too cowardly to claim the one person who makes me feel truly alive." "Edmund," Margaret's voice broke on his name. "Your resilience is the foundation of my future happiness," he continued, his voice rough with emotion. "Your dignity is the standard to which I aspire. Your intelligence is the only conversation partner I want for the rest of my days. These qualities do not fade with age, Margaret. They deepen, they strengthen. In 20 years, you will be even more formidable, even more extraordinary than you are today. And I will be the most fortunate man in England to stand beside you." Margaret stared at him through her tears, seeing in his face nothing but absolute sincerity. No doubt, no hesitation, no subtle reservation. Just love, open and unguarded and utterly genuine. "I am so afraid," she whispered. "So am I," Edmund admitted. "I have not allowed myself to love anyone since my father died. The thought of opening my heart again, of making myself vulnerable to that kind of loss, it terrifies me, Margaret. But I would rather face that fear with you than live safely alone without you." He drew her closer, until their foreheads rested together, their breath mingling in the warm spring air. "We have both been alone for so long. We have both built walls to protect ourselves from further hurt. But my dear brave Margaret, don't you think it's time we took those walls down? Don't you think we've earned the right to be happy, even if that happiness makes us vulnerable? Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the last of her carefully maintained defenses crumbling. Yes, she breathed. Yes, Edmund, I think perhaps we have. When she opened her eyes again, she found him smiling at her with such tenderness that it stole her breath. Then let go of your fear, he urged softly. Trust in us, trust in what we are building together, and know that whatever the future holds, whatever challenges we face, whatever society whispers, whatever doubts may occasionally surface, I will love you. Today, tomorrow, 20 years from now. Your age does not diminish you in my eyes, Margaret. It makes you precious beyond measure. Margaret felt something break open inside her chest, not breaking apart, but breaking free. The internalized shame, the deep-seated belief in her own unworthiness, the certainty that she was too old for love, all of it dissolved in the face of Edmund's unwavering certainty. I love you, she said, her voice stronger now, more certain. Not because you are a duke, not because you offer me position or protection, but because you see me, Edmund. You truly see me, and you find me worthy. That gift is beyond price. Edmund's face transformed with joy. And I love you, Margaret Hensley. Your courage, your intelligence, your dignity, your heart, everything you are, everything you have been, everything you will become. I love all of it, and I always will. He glanced around quickly, noting that Eleanor had diplomatically wandered even further away, then leaned forward to press a gentle, reverent kiss to Margaret's lips. It was brief, chaste, proper, and yet it contained within it the promise of everything to come. When they finally rose from the bench and continued their walk through the gardens, Margaret felt fundamentally changed. The weight she had carried for 20 years, the burden of society's judgment, and her own internalized shame had lifted. She was 40 years old, and the most extraordinary man she had ever known loved her not despite that fact, but in recognition of everything those years had made her. For the first time in 2 decades, Margaret Hensley felt truly free. Chapter 9. The Duke's Soul Partner. The invitation arrived 3 days after their afternoon in the gardens, written in Edmund's now familiar bold hand. Asterisk, my dearest Margaret. Asterisk. Asterisk, I wish to show you Ravenwood Hall, my ancestral estate in Derbyshire. It is the place where I have always felt most myself, unencumbered by society's expectations. I should like very much for you to see it, to understand this part of me. Asterisk. Asterisk, if you are willing, I shall send my carriage on Friday morning. The journey requires 2 days, and I have arranged for you to stay with my cousin, Lady Thornton, who resides nearby and will serve as your chaperone during the visit. Asterisk. Asterisk, I have something of great importance to ask you, and I wish to do so in the place that has always been my truest home. Asterisk. Asterisk. Yours always. Asterisk. Asterisk. Edmund. Asterisk. Margaret read the letter 3 times, her heart quickening with each reading. Something of great importance. She knew what he meant, what he intended. This was not simply a country visit. It was a proposal, formal and deliberate. Eleanor found her sister sitting at her writing desk, the letter clutched in trembling hands, tears streaming down her face. "Margaret? What's wrong?" Eleanor rushed to her side in alarm. "Nothing is wrong," Margaret whispered. "Everything is so impossibly right that I can scarcely believe it's real." The journey to Derbyshire took 2 full days of travel, during which Margaret alternated between excitement and terror. By the time the Ravenwood carriage crested the final hill and the estate came into view, her nerves were stretched taut as violin strings. But then she saw Ravenwood Hall, and her breath caught in her throat. It was magnificent, a Palladian masterpiece of honey-colored stone that seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight. The house sat amid rolling parkland, surrounded by ancient oaks and carefully tended gardens that stretched toward distant hills. But what struck Margaret most was not its grandeur, but the sense of rightness about it. This was not a showpiece designed to intimidate, it was a home, beautiful and welcoming in equal measure. Edmund waited at the entrance, and Margaret's heart leapt at the sight of him. Here, away from London's scrutiny, he seemed more relaxed, his austere features softened by genuine pleasure at her arrival. "Margaret," he greeted her warmly, handing her down from the carriage himself. "Welcome to Ravenwood. Welcome home." The words, "Time's welcome home," times resonated through her with unexpected force. He introduced her to his cousin, Lady Thornton, a pleasant woman in her 50s, who greeted Margaret with warm approval rather than the skepticism she had feared. "Miss Hensley, I am delighted to finally meet you. Edmund has spoken of little else these past weeks." After Margaret was shown to her rooms and given time to refresh herself from the journey, Edmund collected her for a tour of the estate. Lady Thornton, understanding her role, accompanied them at a discreet distance. "I grew up here," Edmund explained, as they walked through the magnificent public rooms. "My father believed strongly that a duke's primary responsibility was to his land and his people, not to London society. He taught me that true nobility lies in how one treats those dependent upon one's care." Margaret observed how the servants greeted Edmund, not with fear or obsequious deference, but with genuine respect and affection. She noticed the prosperous condition of the tenant farms they passed, the well-maintained cottages, the children who waved cheerfully as the Duke's party rode by. "You love this place," she observed quietly. "I do," Edmund admitted. "Here, I am not simply the Duke of Ravenwood, eighth in an ancient line. Here I am Edmund Charles, a man with responsibilities to real people, with connections to the land and those who work it. London makes me feel like a symbol, a title to be courted or avoided. Ravenwood makes me feel human." They paused at the top of a hill overlooking the entire estate, the house visible in the distance, surrounded by the verdant landscape Edmund clearly loved so deeply. "Margaret." Edmund turned to face her, his expression vulnerable in a way she had rarely seen. "I need to tell you something. When I inherited this title at 19, I was utterly unprepared. The responsibility, the scrutiny, the constant demands, it nearly crushed me. I retreated into formality, into distance, because it was the only way I could survive." He gestured toward the landscape spread before them. "But here, alone at Ravenwood, I could still be myself. I could walk these hills, manage the estate, interact with my tenants as a person rather than an institution. This place saved me, Margaret. It reminded me that I was human, not just a title." Margaret remained silent, sensing he needed to continue. "But it was also profoundly lonely," Edmund continued, his voice dropping. "I would stand here and look out over all this beauty, all this prosperity, and feel utterly isolated. I had everything society values: wealth, power, position, and absolutely no one with whom to share it. No one who saw me rather than the Duke. No one who understood that beneath all the trappings, I was simply a man desperate for genuine connection." He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "And then I found you. Margaret, you are the only person I have ever met who sees Edmund Charles rather than the Duke of Ravenwood. The only person whose presence makes me feel complete rather than diminished. The only person I can imagine standing here beside me, sharing this place, building a life together." Margaret's heart thundered against her ribs as Edmund slowly lowered himself to one knee before her, still holding her hands, his grey eyes locked with hers. "Margaret Hensley," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his face. "I am not a man prone to romantic declarations or pretty speeches, but I need you to understand something. You have given me back myself. You have reminded me that I am more than my title, more than my duties, more than the walls I built to protect myself from loss." He released one of her hands to withdraw a small velvet box from his coat pocket. Opening it, he revealed a ring of breathtaking beauty, a large emerald surrounded by diamonds, set in antique gold. "This was my grandmother's ring," Edmund explained. "She was a woman much like you, intelligent, resilient, strong in ways society did not value. My grandfather defied considerable opposition to marry her, and they shared 40 years of profound happiness. I can think of no better legacy to honor than theirs." Margaret's vision blurred with tears as Edmund continued, his voice rough with emotion. "I am asking you to marry me, Margaret, not because you are young or beautiful by society's narrow standards, though you are beautiful to me. Not because you bring wealth or connections, I have no need of those. I am asking because I cannot imagine spending the rest of my life without you. Because you are my soul's partner, the person who makes me feel fully alive for the first time in 20 years. He paused, his vulnerability naked on his face. I know I am asking you to take an enormous risk. To marry me means accepting a position that will bring intense scrutiny, social challenges, and the responsibility of managing great estates and households. But Margaret, I swear to you I will stand beside you through every challenge. I will defend you against every criticism. I will love you every day for the rest of my life. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Please, Margaret, will you marry me? Will you be my wife, my partner, my Duchess? Will you share this life with me, build a future together, and help me remember every day that I am not just a title but a man fortunate enough to love and be loved by the most extraordinary woman I have ever known? Margaret stared down at him through her tears, this powerful man kneeling before her in the landscape he loved most, offering her not just his name and position but his heart, his home, his truest self. Edmund, she whispered, then found her voice growing stronger. You say I have given you back yourself, but you have done the same for me. For 20 years I believed I was invisible, that my worth had expired along with my youth. You saw me when no one else did. You valued me when the world deemed me valueless. You loved me when I had ceased to believe love was possible. She gently freed her hands from his and cupped his face, looking directly into his grey eyes. Yes, Edmund Charles, yes, I will marry you. I will be your wife, your partner, your Duchess. I will stand beside you, share your burdens, and love you for as long as I draw breath. Edmund's face transformed with joy so pure, so unguarded, that it took years from his austere features. He surged to his feet, pulling Margaret into his arms and lifting her off the ground in an embrace that was entirely improper and absolutely perfect. When he finally set her down, he slid the emerald ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, as though it had been waiting for her all along. My Margaret, he murmured, pressing his forehead against hers. My brave, beautiful Margaret, you have made me the happiest man in England. And you have made me believe in miracles, Margaret replied softly. Edmund kissed her then, a kiss deeper and more passionate than their previous chaste contact, full of promise and love and the certainty that they had found in each other exactly what they needed. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and smiling, they stood together looking out over the Ravenwood estate, their estate now, their shared future stretching before them like the verdant landscape. When shall we tell London? Margaret asked, her practical nature reasserting itself. Tomorrow, Edmund replied firmly. I shall send word to the London papers immediately. Let society have its scandal. Let them gossip and speculate and criticize. None of it matters, Margaret. We have found each other, and that is the only truth that counts. Asterisk, asterisk. 2 weeks later, the announcement appeared in the Times. Asterisk, asterisk. Asterisk, the Duke of Ravenwood is pleased to announce his engagement to Miss Margaret Hensley of Hampshire. The wedding will take place at Ravenwood Hall in Derbyshire on the 23rd of June. Asterisk. London society erupted in predictable fashion. Drawing rooms buzzed with disbelief. Matrons clutched their pearls and declared it the scandal of the century. Lady Pemberton pronounced herself utterly astonished that the Duke would throw himself away on such an unsuitable match. But the Duke of Ravenwood was conspicuously absent from London society in the weeks following the announcement. He remained at Ravenwood with his fiancée, utterly indifferent to the storm of gossip they had created. Margaret's family arrived in Derbyshire for an extended visit, and even Lady Hensley found her objections crumbling in the face of Edmund's obvious devotion and Margaret's radiant happiness. I confess, Lady Hensley admitted to her daughter one evening, I never thought to see you so happy, my dear. The Duke clearly adores you. And I him, mother, Margaret replied simply. Thomas, walking with Edmund through the estate, found himself genuinely warming to the man who would become his brother-in-law. You are good for her, he observed. I have not seen Margaret truly smile in 20 years. Now she cannot seem to stop. She is good for me, Edmund replied. She has given me back something I thought lost forever, the ability to feel, to hope, to love. I will spend the rest of my life being worthy of that gift. Asterisk, asterisk. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful. Asterisk, asterisk. The chapel at Ravenwood Hall, built in the 14th century, was filled with flowers and bathed in golden light streaming through ancient stained glass windows. The guest list was small family and true friends only, deliberately excluding the society gossips who had tormented Margaret for so long. Margaret walked down the aisle on Thomas's arm, wearing a gown of ivory silk that Eleanor had insisted brought out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes. At 40 years old, she was not a young bride, but she was radiant, with a happiness that transcended youth. Edmund waited at the altar, resplendent in formal attire, his eyes fixed on his bride with such naked adoration that several guests found themselves wiping away tears. When Margaret reached his side, he took her hand and whispered, "You are breathtaking." "I am 40 years old," she replied with a tremulous smile. "You are perfect," he corrected firmly. The ceremony was simple but deeply moving. When Edmund spoke his vows, his voice rang clear and certain. "I, Edmund Charles, take thee, Margaret, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." Margaret's voice was equally steady as she replied, "I, Margaret, take thee, Edmund Charles, to be my wedded husband, to have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Edmund drew Margaret into his arms and kissed her with a tenderness that made their love unmistakable to every witness. The breakfast that followed was joyous and intimate, filled with genuine warmth rather than social posturing. The Dowager Duchess, who had travelled from Bath for the occasion, stood to offer a toast. "When my son first told me of his intention to marry Miss Hensley, forgive me, the new Duchess of Ravenwood, I confess I had my doubts. Society's expectations are powerful things, and I had assumed my son would choose conventionally." She paused, her eyes moving to Margaret. "But watching them together these past weeks, I have come to understand something. My late husband, Edmund's father, chose me against considerable opposition. He saw in me qualities that society did not value: intelligence, strength of character, resilience. We shared 40 years of profound happiness because he looked beyond surface measures to see my true worth." Her voice grew softer. "I see my son making that same choice, and I could not be more proud of him. Margaret, welcome to the family. You have already proven yourself worthy of the Ravenwood name by making my son happier than I have seen him in 20 years. There was not a dry eye in the room as Edmund rose and embraced his mother, then returned to Margaret's side, taking her hand and pressing a kiss to her knuckles. Asterisk, asterisk. 6 months later, asterisk, asterisk. The Duke and Duchess of Ravenwood made their first appearance in London society at the opening of Parliament. Margaret descended from the Ravenwood carriage in a gown of deep sapphire silk, the Ravenwood emeralds glittering at her throat, her hand resting confidently on her husband's arm. The whispers began immediately, but their tone had shifted. Curiosity replaced malice, respect replaced mockery. Because word had spread from Derbyshire of the new Duchess's grace and intelligence, of her thoughtful management of charitable works, of the clear devotion between the Duke and his wife. Those who had expected the marriage to collapse under the weight of scandal found instead a partnership that strengthened with each passing month. Lady Pemberton, encountering the couple at a reception, found herself stammering a greeting that was almost deferential. "Your Grace," she addressed Margaret, the title carrying weight it had not possessed 6 months earlier. "You are looking well." "Thank you, Lady Pemberton," Margaret replied with gracious dignity. "Happiness agrees with me." It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of vindication. Margaret Hensley, now Margaret Vallemont, Duchess of Ravenwood, stood before London society not as the pitied spinster, but as a woman valued, loved, and respected. That evening, in the privacy of their London townhouse, Edmund drew his wife into his arms. "You were magnificent tonight," he murmured against her hair. "I had an excellent teacher in dignity under scrutiny," Margaret replied, her arms encircling his waist. "I love you," Edmund said simply, "more with each passing day." "And I you," Margaret replied. "You have given me everything I thought impossible: love, partnership, a life of meaning and purpose." No, Edmund corrected gently. You already possessed all those qualities. I simply recognized them and insisted the world acknowledge what should have been evident all along, that you are extraordinary. They stood together in comfortable silence, two people who had found each other against all odds, who had defied convention to claim happiness society insisted they did not deserve. Edmund, Margaret said softly, do you remember what you told me that day at the National Gallery about love and loss being inseparable? I do, he replied. I understand now what you meant. To love you is to accept that one day we will be parted. That loss is inevitable. But Edmund, she pulled back to look into his eyes. I would not trade a single moment of this happiness to avoid that eventual grief. Loving you is worth every risk, every fear, every certain heartbreak that the future holds. Edmund's eyes brightened with moisture as he cupped her face tenderly. My wise, brave Margaret, that is precisely what I meant, and I feel the same. Whatever time we are granted, 20 years, 30, 40, it will not be enough. But I will cherish every moment, every day, every breath we share. They kissed then, a kiss full of love and promise, and the profound gratitude of two souls who had found each other when both had ceased to believe such connection was possible. Outside, London continued its eternal dance of scandal and speculation. But inside the Ravenwood townhouse, a duke and his duchess had found something far more precious than society's approval. They had found each other, and they had found home. Asterisk. 1 year later, in the private sitting room at Ravenwood Hall, Margaret sat writing letters while Edmund reviewed estate documents. It was a peaceful domestic scene, the kind that had become their pattern, working companiously in each other's presence, comfortable in shared silence. Asterisk. Asterisk. Margaret, Edmund said suddenly, setting aside his papers. I've been thinking about something. Asterisk. Asterisk. Only something, she teased gently, looking up from her correspondence. That seems unlike you. Asterisk. Asterisk, he smiled, crossing to sit beside her on the settee. I've been thinking about all those years we spent alone. You enduring society's cruelty, me hiding behind my title. All that time wasted being lonely when we could have been together. Asterisk. Asterisk. We found each other when we were ready, Margaret replied, taking his hand. Perhaps we needed those years to become the people we are now, people capable of recognizing and valuing what we've found. Asterisk. Asterisk. Ever wise, Edmund murmured, raising her hand to his lips. But Margaret, I want you to know something. If I could go back and change it all, erase those lonely years, avoid that pain, I wouldn't. Because every difficult moment, every instance of isolation and loneliness led me to you. And you, my love, are worth every moment of suffering that came before. Asterisk. Asterisk. Margaret's eyes filled with the tears that came more easily now, no longer signs of weakness but expressions of the profound emotions she finally allowed herself to feel. Asterisk. Asterisk. Edmund, she whispered, I spent 20 years believing I was too old for love, too plain for notice, too unmarriageable for hope. And then you saw me. You valued me. You loved me. Not despite who I am, but because of it. Asterisk. Asterisk. She placed her hand over his heart, feeling its steady beat. You gave me back my life. You gave me back myself. How can I ever thank you for that gift? Asterisk. Asterisk. By staying exactly as you are, Edmund replied, by continuing to be the remarkable woman I fell in love with, by sharing this life with me day after day, year after year, for as long as we are granted. Asterisk. Asterisk. They sat together in the comfortable quiet of their private sanctuary, two people who had learned that it is never too late for love, never too late for new beginnings, never too late to claim the happiness the world insists has passed you by. Asterisk. Asterisk. Age had not diminished Margaret's worth, it had defined it, and in Edmund's eyes she would always be exactly what she was in this moment, cherished, valued, and loved beyond measure. Asterisk. Asterisk. The most extraordinary love story is not always the one between the young and beautiful. Sometimes it is the story of two souls who find each other after years of loneliness, who recognize in each other the depth and dignity that superficial society cannot see. Asterisk. Asterisk. Margaret and Edmund had defied every convention, shattered every expectation, and proven that true love recognizes no boundaries of age or circumstance. Asterisk. Asterisk. They had found their happy ending. Asterisk. Asterisk. And it was only the beginning. Asterisk.